Family Affair was great.
Yeah,
I mean,
it felt like a family, I've got to believe.
and Mr. Kobos, the makeup artist
Right.
and hair guy, just said, "Don't touch the tube." So I remember that.
Yeah.
Back in my day, kids never really got starring roles. They were always co-stars.
There's always that one thing we just don't revisit. Maybe it's a song that brings back too many memories, a place that makes our stomach turn, or a photo that we quietly keep buried in a drawer. For Johnny Whitaker, child star of the hit 60s show Family Affair, that thing might just be a single episode he filmed back in 1966, one he's never been able to watch again. Curious? Let's unfold the mystery. The episode that stays unwatched. Now, to be fair, Whitaker hasn't publicly named a specific episode and declared, "I refuse to ever watch this." But over the years, whispers have surfaced in fan forums and interviews that hint at a particular moment in the show's early run that hit him harder than most. It could have been the emotionally charged storyline. It might have been something going on behind the scenes. Or maybe it was just one of those moments that, for whatever reason, stuck with him in a way that made revisiting it feel like reopening an old wound. And honestly, who could blame him? Imagine being 6 years old, tossed into the whirlwind of television stardom, delivering lines about death, loss, or family trauma before you've even learned to ride a bike without training wheels. That was Johnny Whitaker's world. On screen, he played Jody Davis, a sweet, wide-eyed orphan adjusting to life with his new guardian, Uncle Bill, in a Manhattan high-rise. Off-screen, he was a child actor navigating a high-pressure industry filled with lights, cameras, and very adult emotions. Family Affair might have been billed as a light-hearted family show, but it didn't shy away from heavy topics. One episode had his twin sister Buffy dealing with a leukemia scare. Others tackled abandonment, grief, and the deep, aching sadness of losing your parents. For the viewers, it was touching, even cathartic. For a kid like Whitaker, it may have been something else entirely. So, when people talk about that one episode he won't watch, they're not necessarily talking about scandal or controversy. It's more about emotional memory. Think about it. When you're a kid, even pretending to cry on cue can leave a weird imprint on your psyche. Multiply that by years of filming emotionally intense scenes, and it's not hard to imagine why one episode might have crossed some invisible line between acting and feeling too much. But the story doesn't end with one uncomfortable moment. Johnny's journey, from child star to troubled adult to counselor and advocate, reads like a Hollywood movie script all its own. It's filled with highs, lows, painful losses, redemption arcs, and a deeper understanding of what it means to survive fame and come out the other side with clarity. This isn't just about an episode never rewatched. It's about the long shadow childhood fame can cast. It's about how a single scene, a few spoken lines, or a tough day on set can linger for decades. Most of all, it's about Whitaker, the boy with the bowl cut and big eyes who grew up in front of the camera, but still had to find his way in real life, off script. A boy in the spotlight. Before Johnny became a household name, he was just a kid from Van Nuys, California, with a mop of reddish hair and an easy, camera-friendly smile. He didn't stumble into acting so much as he marched into it, professionally, promptly, and before he could tie his own shoes. His very first gig? A live TV commercial for a syrup brand when he was just 3 years old. Most toddlers are figuring out how to say please and thank you. Johnny was already hitting his marks. From there, it was a pretty fast climb. He landed small roles in TV and film, his face popping up in commercials, sitcoms, and family-friendly movies. By the time he was cast in Family Affair in 1966, Johnny was just 6 years old, but already a veteran of the business in kid years. Think of him as the preschooler equivalent of a Hollywood pro. He had timing, presence, and that intangible it factor that casting directors go bananas for. Family Affair was the show that truly put him on the map. The premise was simple but heartfelt. Bachelor Bill Davis suddenly finds himself the guardian of 3 orphaned children, Buffy, Jody, and Sissy. The show centered around how this new, unlikely family adjusted to life together. It had comedy, charm, and just enough sentiment to tug at the heartstrings without diving into full soap opera territory. But for Johnny, landing the role of Jody Davis wasn't just another step, it was the leap. He was now a full-blown series regular on a primetime hit. He worked alongside veteran actor Brian Keith, Uncle Bill, child actress Anissa Jones, Buffy, and Sebastian Cabot, Mr. French, the butler with the world's most patient sigh. And week after week, America watched Jody grow up right before their eyes. Behind the scenes, though, being a child actor wasn't all grins and studio applause. It was long hours, constant memorization, and an emotional workload that most kids simply aren't equipped for. While other kids were climbing trees or riding bikes after school, Johnny was on set, often filming scenes with serious, dramatic undertones. Crying on cue? Yep. Delivering heartfelt lines about dead parents and starting over in a new home, all in a day's work. It's easy to forget just how much Family Affair leaned into emotional territory. Sure, it was a sweet family sitcom, but it was also a show that opened with tragedy. The death of Jody and Buffy's parents. That loss loomed over the series in subtle ways. Johnny had to channel feelings of abandonment, confusion, and sadness, and he had to do it convincingly, even though he hadn't lived through anything like it. That kind of acting can be confusing for a kid. After all, how do you pretend to grieve something you don't fully understand? That's not to say Johnny didn't love the work. By all accounts, he enjoyed acting. He loved learning scripts, hitting his marks, and working with the cast. But enjoying the process didn't always mean it was easy. There's a strange kind of weight that child actors carry. They're expected to perform like adults while still figuring out who they are. And in Johnny's case, he was doing it while playing a character whose life had been shattered by loss. He's spoken in interviews about how protective Brian Keith was of him and Anissa. On set, the older cast members tried to shield the kids from the darker parts of the industry, but they couldn't shield them from the emotional material they were filming. And while Johnny was praised for his natural ability to act, he could flip a switch and cry on cue. It's worth wondering what it took out of him to do that week after week. There's a reason so many child stars from that era hit bumps in the road later on. When your childhood is wrapped in scripts and camera angles, it's hard to develop a strong sense of self. Johnny grew up knowing how to perform, but like many child actors, he had to figure out later how to just be. When people speculate about that one episode Johnny Whitaker won't watch, maybe it's not about a single moment that was too painful. Maybe it's a representation of an entire chapter of his life, one filled with bright lights and big smiles, but also long days, emotional demands, and very little room to just be a kid. That's a lot to carry in such a small pair of shoes. Behind the curtain, let's be real, when most people think of Family Affair, they remember the warm fuzzies. Cute kids, wholesome storylines, a caring uncle, and a British butler who was always somehow exasperated, yet unshakably loyal. It was comfort TV at its finest, the kind of show you could watch with your grandma and your little cousin, and still enjoy. But peel back that glossy 60s sitcom surface, and there was a surprising amount of emotional depth, even darkness, bubbling underneath. And for a 6-year-old Johnny, living through those scripts wasn't always easy. On paper, Family Affair seemed simple. 3 kids, Sissy, Buffy, and Jody, move in with their wealthy bachelor uncle after their parents tragically die in a car crash. That's the starting point. From day one, the show was steeped in loss. Every awe moment was built on a foundation of grief, whether the characters were confronting it head-on or just trying to pretend everything was okay. Whitaker, playing little Jody, was smack in the middle of that emotional storm. Sure, there were episodes where he got to do silly kid stuff, climbing things he shouldn't, sneaking around, playing with frogs, or making messes. But those light moments were often balanced by some pretty heavy themes. And remember, this wasn't a drama. It was a primetime sitcom expected to make audiences feel warm and fuzzy in under 30 minutes. Now imagine being 6 or 7 years old, walking onto a set where today's assignment is to cry on cue because your TV sister might be dying from leukemia, or your TV uncle is thinking of sending you and your sister away, or you feel unwanted and unloved again. The lines may have been scripted, but the emotions? They were real. At least, they had to feel that way on camera. And for a kid who was still learning what emotions even were, acting them out repeatedly may have left a deeper mark than anyone realized at the time. There are stories from the set of episodes like Buffy's Fair Lady or The Candy Striper that required more intense performances from the child actors. One especially emotional arc involved Buffy being hospitalized with what's feared to be leukemia, an incredibly dark storyline for a show that aired at dinner time. Jody's reactions were key to the emotional core of that episode. He was scared, he was confused, he was heartbroken, all of the things a little brother would be if his twin sister was in danger. And it wasn't just a one-off emotional moment. These scenes were rehearsed, blocked, and filmed from multiple angles. That's a lot of time spent pretending to panic about losing your sister. While there's no confirmed public record of Whitaker saying, "I will never watch that episode," it's easy to see why some moments might be too emotionally charged to revisit. Not because the acting was bad, it wasn't, he was phenomenal, but because some performances dig their way into your memory and take root. For Johnny, watching a scene like that now wouldn't just be watching a performance, it would be watching a younger version of himself wrestling with feelings he may not have fully understood at the time. Behind the scenes, the crew tried to make things as easy as possible for the kids. Brian Keith, who played Uncle Bill, was famously protective of his younger co-stars. He had a gruff exterior, but he adored Johnny and Anissa. He reportedly went out of his way to make them laugh between takes, even stepping in to lighten the mood during tough scenes. Still, the nature of the show meant those tough scenes kept coming. And it wasn't just about the serious scripts. Filming a TV show, especially in the 60s, meant a rigid schedule, multiple takes, long days, minimal downtime. Even when the cameras weren't rolling, the pressure to perform lingered. Johnny had to be on almost constantly, which left very little room for just being a kid. All of that builds up. Over time, emotional moments start to blend with lived experience. Scenes you cried through become memories you don't want to revisit, even if the tears were scripted. Maybe that's why there's talk of one particular episode from the 1966 season, likely one of the heavier ones, that Johnny just can't bring himself to watch again. Even if it wasn't painful then, maybe it is now, through the eyes of someone who's lived a lot of life since. For the audience, Family Affair is nostalgia, something to re-watch with warm feelings. But for Johnny, some of those scenes are snapshots of a childhood spent under lights, saying lines about loss and fear before he even knew what those things truly meant. It's no surprise one episode might stand out in his memory not as a favorite, but as something better left unplayed. When Family Affair wrapped in 1971 after 5 seasons, Johnny Whitaker was barely into his teens, but already a seasoned actor with a resume most adults would envy. For a lot of kids in his shoes, the end of a big show would mean a career cool-down, maybe a quiet retreat into normal life. But for Johnny, things kept going. For a while. A sudden exit from the spotlight. Johnny jumped straight into new projects, most notably starring as Tom Sawyer in the 1973 musical film adaptation alongside Jodie Foster, and later headlining the Saturday morning show Sigmund and the Sea Monsters. If Family Affair showed his dramatic chops, these roles let him play things a little lighter. Singing, running around, getting into mischief, he was still America's favorite red-headed kid, just in a slightly sillier setting. But beneath the surface, the glow of fame was already starting to dim. Child actors age out of their roles, and Johnny wasn't immune to that awkward in-between stage. Too old to play the wide-eyed little boy, too young to convincingly take on teen heartthrob roles, he found himself in what Hollywood insiders call the fade. It's that weird limbo-like phase when casting directors stop calling, your voice changes, your face matures, and the audience kind of moves on. For Johnny, that fade wasn't just professional, it became personal. Acting had been his identity for so long that when it slowed down, he wasn't quite sure what to do with himself. He still made appearances, dabbled in music, and took smaller roles here and there, but the momentum he'd once had was slipping. And in the background, real life was getting messier. In 1976, tragedy hit hard. Anissa Jones, his Family Affair co-star and close friend, died of a harmful substance overdose at just 18 years old. The news stunned fans, but for Johnny, it was something deeper. Anissa had been like a sister to him, on screen and off. They'd spent years playing twins, sharing scenes, studio classrooms, and growing up in parallel under the microscope of fame. Her death wasn't just the loss of a friend. It was a brutal reminder of how fragile life could be, especially for kids thrust too young into the spotlight. Johnny has spoken candidly about how that moment marked a turning point for him. It was the first time he really had to face the darker consequences of early fame. The same industry that had lifted them up didn't always know how to support young stars once the cameras stopped rolling. Anissa's passing left a void, and maybe also a warning. He managed to avoid the worst of the spotlight crashes at first. He graduated high school, went on a church mission in Portugal, and tried to find something like a normal adult life. But the pressures didn't go away. Over time, Johnny himself would fall into the same traps that claimed so many former child stars: harmful substance use, addiction, and isolation. His story wasn't as public or sensationalized as others, but it followed a familiar script: fame early, confusion later. By the 80s and early 90s, he had all but disappeared from the public eye. Fans who remembered Jodie Davis wondered where he'd gone. The answer was, quite frankly, into the wilderness. Substance abuse took its toll, and his once promising path narrowed into survival mode. And yet, this is also where Johnny's story takes a powerful turn. Because unlike many who vanished and never returned, he found a way back. It took time. It took hitting rock bottom. But eventually, with the help of his family, especially his sister, Johnny sought help got clean, and began the long, often brutal journey of recovery. That's when he started to truly reflect on what his childhood had been. The fame, the pressure, the loss. The episode he couldn't watch. All of it had left scars, but it hadn't completely broken him. Today, people still ask him about family affair, about the episodes that made them cry, or laugh, or feel something real. And maybe one of those episodes, the one he still can't bring himself to watch, is tangled up in that first big heartbreak, losing Anissa, losing the illusion that childhood stardom would keep everyone safe and happy forever. Whitaker may have exited the spotlight quickly, but he didn't disappear. He just had to find a new script, one that wasn't written by TV writers, but by life, healing, and hard-won perspective. A battle off-screen. Whitaker's journey didn't end when the cameras stopped rolling. It just took a darker, more complicated turn. Like so many child actors who grow up under studio lights, Johnny found himself struggling once the glow faded. The fame that once felt exciting and full of promise had quietly morphed into something heavier. Expectations, confusion, and a looming question he couldn't quite answer. Who am I when the audience isn't watching? By the early 80s, Johnny was no longer the sweet-faced kid America adored on Family Affair. He was an adult, trying to make sense of a life that had been scripted for him since before kindergarten. He'd always been known as Jody, and even though he'd continued acting into his teens, that identity stuck. But off-screen, he was just Johnny. No script, no stage, and no idea what came next. That sense of disorientation slowly gave way to something more dangerous. Addiction. Like many former child stars, Johnny began experimenting with harmful substance and alcohol. What started casually spiraled into dependency. He's spoken openly about how addiction became the thing that filled the gap once acting no longer did. It numbed the pain, blurred the memories, and made the confusion go quiet, at least for a while. Years passed. The roles dried up. The public forgot. And Johnny sank deeper. At one point, he lost nearly everything: his career, his health, his sense of self. He was no longer a star. He was a man in free fall. But the turning point came in the most unexpected and powerful way, through an intervention led by his sister. She gave him an ultimatum: get help or face losing the family's support altogether. It was the kind of wake-up call that doesn't come with applause or theme music. It was raw, scary, and real. And it worked. Johnny entered rehab. The process wasn't quick, and it wasn't clean. Recovery rarely is, but step by step, he began to rebuild. For someone who had grown up reciting lines written by other people, it was the first time he truly began authoring his own story. As he got sober, Johnny didn't just focus on his own healing. He wanted to help others, too. He became a certified counselor, using his experience to support people walking similar paths. It wasn't about being a former child star with a redemption arc. It was about being a human being who'd been through hell and made it back. He also returned to his faith. Johnny grew up Mormon, and while he drifted away during his years of addiction, spirituality became a core part of his recovery journey. He even served a mission earlier in life in Portugal, something he's said gave him a sense of structure and purpose, two things that had been missing during the height of his acting career. In interviews, Johnny has talked about his recovery with the kind of honesty that makes people lean in. There's no sugarcoating, no Hollywood spin, just the truth. Addiction took years of his life, but sobriety gave him back more than he ever expected. It gave him peace, clarity, and the ability to look back, not with bitterness, but with understanding. Still, Even in sobriety, some things are too tender to touch. And maybe that's where the episode comes in. Not necessarily as a literal one-time performance he refuses to see, but as a symbol. A chapter of his life that carries too much weight. When you've spent your childhood portraying grief and your adulthood living it, there are bound to be scenes that hit too close to home. Johnny's work as a counselor became more than a job. It became a calling. He didn't need to wear a costume or deliver lines anymore. Just showing up and telling the truth was enough. His story resonated because it wasn't a fairy tale comeback. It was real-life recovery, hard-earned and ongoing. People often expect childhood stars to crash and burn, or alternatively, to live perfectly charmed lives forever. Johnny's story falls somewhere in between. It's not always clean or comfortable, but it's true. And in many ways, it's far more powerful than anything he did on screen. Recovery gave Johnny a second chance, but what really made that second act meaningful was how he chose to fill it: faith, healing, and public rebirth. Once he was sober and clear-headed, he didn't just want to be the guy who got clean. He wanted to be someone who helped others stay clean. He wanted to make peace with the past and build something better in the present. Part of that healing process meant reconnecting with the roots he'd drifted from during his years of addiction, especially his faith. Johnny had been raised in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and while it wasn't something he wore on his sleeve during his Hollywood years, it had always been there in the background. After rehab, he leaned into that foundation in a deeper way. His faith didn't erase the pain or the memories, but it gave him something steady to hold on to. Spirituality helped him find structure and purpose, and that structure helped him stay clean. He began attending meetings, mentoring others in recovery, and rebuilding relationships that had fractured during the rough years. He wasn't trying to be a saint, just a man on a better path. At the same time, Johnny began re-entering the public eye, but this time on his own terms. He wasn't chasing roles or trying to reclaim childhood fame. Instead, he showed up in documentaries, podcasts, and interviews where he talked about life beyond the spotlight. What stood out wasn't just his honesty, it was the lack of ego. He didn't try to spin his story into something glamorous. He was just real. He talked about losing Anissa, about addiction, about surviving the machine of early fame, and people listened. He also got involved in work behind the scenes, consulting on child actor welfare, supporting other former stars, and advocating for mental health and sobriety in the entertainment industry. At events and panels, fans would approach him with tears in their eyes, clutching old DVD sets of Family Affair, telling him how much his character meant to them. Johnny appreciated the love, but he didn't pretend that every memory attached to those years was sweet. Sometimes he'd gently deflect questions about certain episodes. Other times, he'd share a story and then quietly move on. When people asked about that episode, the one he might never watch again, he'd smile and say something like, "Some memories are best left in the vault." He didn't need to explain it. The pain behind those scenes didn't have to be relived to be real. What made his public rebirth so compelling was that it wasn't a comeback in the traditional Hollywood sense. He wasn't trying to be a star again, he was just trying to live well, speak truthfully, and stay grounded. That, in many ways, is more impressive than any role he ever played. As the years passed, Johnny began to find joy in small moments, visiting fans at nostalgia conventions, mentoring recovering addicts, giving interviews where he could laugh at the chaos of his early life without minimizing it. He even dipped back into acting here and there, but only when it felt right. No pressure, no spotlight chasing, just art for the sake of it. In his own words, He often says that he doesn't regret being a child actor, but he does acknowledge the emotional cost. It's the kind of experience that shapes you, for better or worse. And while not every scene is one he wants to relive, he's made peace with most of them. The enduring legacy of one single episode. We're back where we started. That one episode Johnny Whitaker still can't watch. Maybe it's from the first season, maybe it's buried somewhere in the middle. But the specifics don't really matter. What matters is what it represents. It's easy to assume that the hardest moments for actors come from scandal or controversy. But for Johnny, the episode he avoids isn't about a tabloid headline, it's about emotion. Raw, unresolved, maybe even unexplainable emotion. And that makes perfect sense when you consider the pressure cooker environment he grew up in. He wasn't just playing a kid with trauma. He was a kid being asked to perform someone else's trauma over and over again in front of cameras and crew. Whether it was the fear of losing Buffy, the weight of being the orphaned child, or just the sheer emotional toll of being so young and expected to cry on cue, something about that one episode stuck. Maybe it blurred the line between acting and real feeling. Maybe it triggered something that was already brewing off camera. Or maybe it was just too much for a 6-year-old to carry, and too vivid to revisit as an adult. The idea that a single episode can hold so much emotional weight isn't unique to Johnny. Many former child stars have spoken about similar moments, scenes or entire productions that years later feel like emotional landmines. The difference is that Johnny's never sensationalized it. He's never tried to cash in on pain. If anything, he's been gentle about it, almost protective of that memory. And that says a lot, because sometimes healing doesn't mean revisiting every painful moment. It doesn't mean watching the hard parts on a screen and forcing yourself to be okay with them. Sometimes healing means allowing yourself the space to not go there, to say, "No thanks," and move on without guilt. That's what Johnny seems to have done with this particular piece of his past. In the end, Johnny Whitaker's legacy isn't defined by a single episode or even by Family Affair as a whole. It's defined by how he grew from that experience, how he fell, got back up, and used what he'd learned to help others. His story isn't about fame or failure. It's about resilience. So yes, there may always be one episode he'll never rewatch. But there are countless more chapters in his life that he's written since. Ones filled with honesty, purpose, and peace. And those are the stories that matter most. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe for more.